All right, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Evolution of Building Performance Metrics, presented by the IBPSA-USA Education Committee. Today's session will be recorded and available through the IBPSA-USA YouTube channel. If you have any issues hearing the presentation, please try calling in by phone. You can find that information on your registration invite or email. Instead of using the computer audio. This is a Zoom webinar, so you can participate by posting questions and comments in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be available to all attendees, and there's also an option to submit your questions anonymously if you prefer. We will have a Q&A section towards the end of today's webinar, but if you prefer to submit your questions as we go along, we encourage that as well. You can also upvote or comment on questions that resonate with you. We welcome your questions, thoughts, and ideas as we continue to work towards IBPSA-USA's mission of fostering better buildings through simulation. It is my pleasure to hand over the microphone now to Apurva Pradhan, Chair of the Emerging Professionals and Students of IBPSA-USA, also known as EPSI, and also an active member of the IBPSA-USA Education Committee.
Hello, everyone. I would like to introduce today's speakers, Jack Rusk, Jared Landsman, and Jamie Backus. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers. Let's start with Jack. Jack is the Director of Climate Strategy at EHDD, an architecture firm with offices in San Francisco and Seattle. He works across projects at the firm to identify and implement climate-positive design strategies. He also leads development of the EPIC tool, which is a web-based application for planning carbon reductions. Jack is the graduate of Yale School of Environment and Yale School of Architecture. In the past few years, he has published and presented research on ecosystem restoration, life cycle impacts of bio-based materials, urban hazard risk, and decarbonization policies, consequences for health and social equity. Take it away, Jack.
Thanks so much, Apurva and Christine, and thank you for having me, everyone. I'll bring up my deck, and it's an honor to kick off this presentation on metrics, the evolution of building performance metrics. And my focus is going to start with metrics at the building scale, from energy to carbon and beyond. Part of this is a sort of, we'll say, abbreviated historical overview of how we've gotten to the present moment, and then an exploration of really the crucial moment we're at right now in the evolution of these metrics. So to start out, we'll move backwards to 2006, when Architecture 2030 first introduced what they called the 2030 Challenge that later became the 2030 Commitment when it was taken up by the AIA. The 2030 Challenge, when issued, described a reduction in emissions associated with buildings against a baseline. And you note some of the energy used here, the language used here, fossil fuel energy consumption, right? As targeting a carbon neutral building by 2030. In 2006, this was 25 years away, and it felt like there was a long runway to getting there. We're much closer now. And as we've gotten closer, we've sort of had to evolve some of our understandings of these core concepts. So together with the 2030 Challenge, Architecture 2030 put out a really neat kind of platform called Zero Tool, which many of people maybe on this call have used in some way, either natively through the web interface or via API. Zero Tool is the tool that Architecture 2030 created to help meet the 2030 Challenge. And you see here in these graphics generated by the tool, the fact that they had to sort of start to refine the carbon neutral vision and the idea of what is fossil fuel energy use over time. They started aligning on the EUI metric, the energy use intensity, just kBTU per square foot per year, or kilowatt hour per meter squared in the EU and other parts of the world, as really the core metric to be tracking towards here. So they present a bunch of results, but really they set the target that everybody is working towards as part of the 2030 Challenge as site EUI, not source EUI, not emissions necessarily. And this really created a strong signal in the industry that energy use intensity, in the strict sense, right, was really what we were targeting to reduce to stay aligned with our climate goals. And this, right, rolled forward from 2006 through the creation of Zero Tool into the present day. There's parallel to this is a conversation happening about, well, wait a minute. Site EUI describes the use of energy on site, but it's not the whole picture. All that energy comes from other sources upstream. Jared will talk about what happens on the grid side. We're actually missing a lot with this narrow focus just on site energy. For instance, where that energy comes from upstream. And this has started sort of like a debate that ran from then till now about how to think about site energy metrics versus source energy metrics. And if the narrow focus on the building site isn't maybe the only thing we should be considering. I'm going to leave aside the difference between site EUI and source EUI, mostly because when it comes to carbon analysis of buildings, actually source energy use isn't really treated very closely. Some source energy use in the way it's treated, say, an Energy Star portfolio manager, uses simplified metrics to describe the energy content of the fuels that are used upstream using, sort of magic numbers like 3, or I think it's like 2.85, to describe the energy content in the fossil fuels. And it does a kind of bad job describing some of the temporal differences between fossil fuel generation and some renewables. So source EOI, we see in the sort of carbon analysis space, taking a backseat to a different set of metrics. What we see really instead, when we think about aggregate energy use platforms, is a really simple kind of math that happens. And this is the math that I would say, like, for a long time, passed as a solid operational carbon analysis, where you start with the total annual building energy use and kilowatt hours or similar, the emissions rate from eGrid or a similar sort of platform that gives you the emissions rate per kilowatt hour of that's incurred when the building sort of uses emissions from the grid, to give you a nice round total number of annual emissions from building energy use. You might do a parallel calculation here if there's on-site fossil fuel use to describe, right, that sort of energy use against that emissions factor, but it's a really simplified, analyzed approach to operational emissions. And again, this is still the back of the envelope calculation that you see embedded in many tools, workflows, and even policies describing operational emissions. But obviously, right, or maybe obviously, and I think, again, Jared will cover this in more detail, this is only the first part of the picture in aggregate. And we see actually that time of use, the hour in which that energy is used, really matters for the emissions associated with it. So this is a graphic from a 2019 report from Atelier 10, and it's a simplified version of hours of each day across months of each year, showing patterns in marginal emission rates. So when an additional kilowatt hour of energy is pulled from the electrical grid, what resource will meet that need, and what are the emissions associated with that resource? And you see here sort of patterns, right? We can go in, it's probably a whole nother webinar to describe what drives these patterns. But the fact is that energy used at one part of the day during one part of the year is actually very different than that in another. Comparing that to patterns in annual building energy use, you're able to do a more sophisticated analysis of operational emissions over the course of the year. Again, the math here is relatively straightforward. Rather than just a single product of emissions and energy use, you do the same on an hourly scale and sum them. So for each hour of the year, you multiply the energy use times the emissions, the marginal emissions rate or average emission rate, depending on the use case, from the grid. And that gives you your total annual emissions from building energy use. And this has been sort of an evolution of this process, moving just from EUI to a sort of like rough calculation of emissions to really one that has something to do with patterns, temporal patterns in building energy use and temporal patterns in building grid emissions. And I think one thing to point out is that there's a difference between the sort of time-based approach to building emissions and the aggregate annualized approach. And this is a summary report from that same figure that summarizes what these differences are. So we see, for instance, in some cases, right, the hourly emissions estimate is lower, say, for instance, in Minneapolis. In some places, such as Long Island, it's much higher. And they see Atelier 10 in their analysis across 3 use types and about a dozen cities saw swings of plus or minus 50% difference between the annualized and the time of use math for just operational emissions, telling us that we'll say, simplified approach that things like the 2030 challenge and 2030 commitment that are built around, the annualized EOI, maybe don't actually have the level of resolution necessary to understand real patterns. And I think this has been a clear evolution we've seen over the last few years. Another evolution we've seen over the last few years is that a lot more emissions are associated with buildings than just from energy use. This takes us to figures like this, which you'll see in various permutations during the presentation today. And the idea that's developed globally coming out of the practice of life cycle assessment of whole life carbon accounting, including the upstream emissions associated with the manufacturing of products, their assembly on site, their replacement over time, the end-of-life processes where these things are recovered, recycled, or sent to landfill, and in only one very, very small part of this, the energy used in the building, right? All of the attention that's we've seen on things like the 2030 commitment or the sort of like decarbonization pathways that get the most attention now are this small section of this large sort of like source of emissions we see in a building. But really the goal on any analysis that we're performing as building professionals is that the scope of analysis of environmental impacts we should be performing has as its strict minimum the scope of work we're performing. So if a building is operating, right, it's generating some operating emissions. If we're involved in the construction of assets, there's emissions associated with that. If you're in the position where you're operating an asset, say, and it's a distribution center and trucks leave it and arrive at it every day, these transportation emissions happen as well. So a whole life carbon perspective helps as an industry and as building practitioners prevent chopping up the scope so that you're only accounting narrowly for one emission source and able to understand the sort of full environmental impacts associated with our work. We see this moving forward in various policies and regulations. But the first thing maybe to note, to hark back to the earlier conversation of operational emissions, is there's actually a whole nother dimension of time, we'll say a different temporal dimension here. So rather than the operational emissions calculations that look at emissions within a year, say hour by hour or minute by minute, whatever that resolution is, to do whole life carbon assessment, because it covers the life of an asset over, say, 60 years is often the reference study period, sometimes 80, sometimes less. You actually need to know what the things like the electrical grid are going to do into the future. This is a snapshot from the scenario viewer of the Cambium scenarios by the National Renewable Energy Lab showing the sort of base case emission rates through 2050. And these are the sorts of data sets that are used to do whole life carbon accounting, right? Including that B6 phase that is the operational energy across the time horizon necessary. And you see different versions of this being used in, say, the UK, in the US, et cetera. But instead of now looking at the intra-annual variation in emissions, we have to look at the inter-annual over the lifespan of the building. So while whole life carbon analysis is now being rolled out in policies such as and standards such as the RICS whole life carbon standard in the UK, a global standard with its origin there, or the forthcoming ASHRAE 240P standard, which will govern whole life carbon standards in the US and globally. That's a joint standard by the ICC and ASHRAE. We also see it being advanced in certifications. About a month ago, maybe a little more at this point, the USGBC and GBCI released the public comment draft of LEED v5. LEED v5 includes numerous credits related to whole life carbon. So there's as one of the integrated process credits, a carbon assessment that includes carbon sources across the building life cycle. A required credit in the materials section of the certification is to assess embodied carbon, and the operational carbon projection decarbonization plan, using the word projection because you have to look into the future using these grid scenarios to do it, is required as part of the energy and atmosphere set of credits. So we see this moving from, we'll say, like academic exercise at the edge of practice to being actually core to the way buildings will be designed and delivered, buildings and retrofits will be designed and delivered in the future. I want to call out some work that we've been doing. I'll give the briefest sort of probably just 1-minute demonstration of the tool itself, but EHD developed the early phase integrated carbon assessment an early phase tool to help drive whole carbon decisions from the very beginning of a project when data is scarce, but the potential for reductions is high. It's available totally open access and free online. And we see it as part of like a currently sort of splintered workflow and doing whole life carbon over the course of a building delivery process, where a tool like Epic or other great tools like CARE can be used at the beginning of a project to set strategy and determine goals. Really, then the workflow bifurcates into tools that you might already be using, like Energy Plus or things baked around Energy Plus for energy and operational emissions modeling, tools like Tally LCA for lifecycle assessment, or Pathfinder for site impacts, forward to tools like EC3 for procurement. So really, like as we see this profusion of tools to understand and reduce carbon emissions from buildings, we view these tools as fulfilling different parts in this workflow. And we as designers at EHCD actually use multiple tools in the course of any building design process, with the idea that each serves a very particular use case. Epic, to give the briefest demonstration, is meant to make the early phase of design really straightforward. So just by entering like a simple set of parameters, like the name of a building, I'll put in a zip code, say in California, where I'm located, and if it's 4 stories and each above ground story is, say, a certain size, you're able to instantly get at something like a whole life carbon view. You can refine the scope. Say you want to look over 60 years, you want to remove interior fit out and MEP. It'll make those adjustments live. You can look at emissions over time, say over the 60-year time horizon we've chosen, and you can start to see the impact of strategies like electrification or switching to a light wood frame structural system really easily. Again, available totally open access. So that brings me to the end of my presentation and sort of, we'll say, the amuse-bouche of the evolution of building performance metrics. And I'm excited to pass it over so we can take a deeper dive into what is happening in other parts of the industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack, for walking us through the journey of the matrix and highlighting the fact that operational carbon is such a tiny portion of the whole pie, and we need to be looking at the whole pie and not just a tiny portion. Thank you. So we encourage folks to add their questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to that at the end of all the 3 presentations. Now let's welcome Jared Landsman. Jared has joined E3 in 2021, where he works primarily on the building electrification and decarbonization from a technical, policy, and economic lens. Jared has developed a number of models to forecast heat pump adoption, both on a regional and a national scale, as well as help cities and states understand the consumer and utility impacts of building electrification. He also works on campus decarbonization, helping universities achieve their net zero emission target. Prior to joining E3, Jared worked at an MEP engineering firm, Integral Group, leading the building performance team with a focus on energy and carbon modeling, policy and guideline development, and demand forecasting. Jared holds a Master of Science in Architecture, Building Science, and Sustainability from University of California, Berkeley, and BS in Civil Engineering from Cornell University. The floor is all yours, Jared.
Thanks so much. So I am going to take a slightly different approach than Jack today and focus sort of narrowly just on the operational carbon, but I will sort of, on a similar note, sort of take a step back and try to view the picture more holistically. I will try to bring sort of like two perspectives to this presentation today. One being that in the first part of my career, I did building energy simulation sort of every day, working on one building at a time, very detailed modeling. And today I have the opportunity at E3 to really sort of look at things from a larger perspective, from often a state or national perspective. And so with that, I'm really going to try to focus today with the lens of what's going on in California and how we can learn from what California has been doing over the last decade. I'll share my screen. All right. So yeah, so I think the focus that I'd really like to have today is, how can we evaluate cost-effective building decarbonization? by understanding what's happening in the state of California. And so I'd like to sort of talk about a few different metrics that have been used in the state. One category is called cost tests, which I will define in just a moment. And the other is sort of under the category of compliance metrics. And if you have done any energy simulation in the state of California, you know that these compliance metrics are a very confusing and complex thing that I'd say most energy modelers don't fully understand what they mean or how they are developed. So I'd like to try to open that black box today and help people understand the full picture. But first, I want to sort of set the scene with these metrics of cost tests. And I think this will actually help give a better sense of what compliance metrics are. So cost tests are something that have essentially been defined by the California Public Utility Commission. And they are used essentially as a methodological framework to examine costs and benefits from different perspectives of implementing a specific measure. So these are just some of the examples of some of the standardized cost tests that exist in the state of California. I think the ones that I really want to highlight today are the participant cost test, or PCT. I think this is what, as energy simulators, we often think about. Really, what is the customer going to experience in terms of their costs and benefits? But I also want to call attention to a few of these others. So the ratepayer impact measure. This is really what is the utility going to experience, or what will all the customers who are not implementing this measure experience? And the other one I really want to call attention to is what's called the total resource cost test, or the TRC. And this, I think, is one of the critical metrics that is used in the state of California to understand, sort of on a more societal level, what will the state, what costs and benefits will the state incur? So I sort of just covered this already, but the PCT, as I said, is really about what the participant will experience in terms of if they implement a measure. And the TRC is the benefits and costs to the state. One thing I want to call attention to is that there is also a societal cost test, which differs just a bit. The TRC really does not include any societal benefits that can't be monetized, whereas the societal cost test actually aims to monetize some of those benefits that are not typically monetized. You guys still hear me? Yep, great. So these are some examples of typical costs and benefits that we often see included in these cost tests, and which actual, from each perspective, how these components actually are incurred as a cost or benefit. So I'd say this participant column, that's sort of what we're used to seeing. There's these upfront costs and maintenance costs that a customer or participant would incur. And then on the benefit side, they might see some bill savings and incentives. From a ratepayer or utility perspective, there's sort of a marginal cost that they might experience that might be an additional cost, or it might be a marginal cost savings, depending on which measure is implemented. But then there's all these costs that we as energy modelers often don't think about. So how much do they have to pay to provide customers incentives, or how much do they have to pay to run certain programs, or how much revenue will be lost if a certain measure is implemented? And then from the state perspective, these things, some of these sort of cancel out. So bill savings, a customer might pay more, a utility might incur less revenue, but as a state, there's no actual cost and benefit there. So the state perspective, or the TRC, is actually often what is used in the state of California for a utility to make a decision on what kind of program to implement. And just to sort of highlight that in graphical form, if there's some specific measure that we see here from a participant perspective where the benefits outweigh the costs, the state or utility really needs to look at the comprehensive picture and understand from a utility perspective,
the costs are far outweighing the benefit. And from a state perspective, the costs are just slightly outweighing the benefit. And so maybe this, even though from a customer perspective, this makes a lot of sense and will yield net benefits, from a state perspective, this might not be the most cost-effective measure to implement. So we really need to start thinking in this kind of mindset about what is happening at the participant level, but also at the state level. And I think this sort of tees up this question of what are the California's compliance metrics and what do they actually represent? So as I mentioned, for those who have done any modeling in CBEC, there's a lot of questions. What on earth do these metrics mean? What do they represent? What is a TDV? Where does it come from? And what on earth is a KTDV? That this is sort of a big mystery to most of us. So sort of taking a step back, this all started in California with something called the Warren-Alquist Act. In addition to the actual creation of the California Energy Commission and energy efficiency standards, this act set a specific requirement that the standards be cost-effective when taken in their entirety and amortized over the economic life of the structure. So what that means is that when something is to be added or incorporated into California's energy code, it must be cost-effective. And that is sort of where all these metrics in California started. So that sort of brings us to today. For those of you who have done modeling in California for code compliance, you will probably know the term TDV, or time-dependent value factors. If you have been keeping up with the latest on the 2025 code cycle, you might see that these metrics are actually changing name. The new name is going to be long-term system cost factors, but they are essentially representing the same metric. And so what does this actually represent? These are trying to capture the net present value lifetime cost over a 30-year period of all building operation energy costs associated with the building that's being designed. As I mentioned, these have historically been using these metrics of these energy metrics, KDTV. Moving forward, and what those were essentially dollars that were multiplied by a scalar and sort of an arbitrary scalar just to convert and present these as energy units in order to prevent the perception that these metrics represented a first-year utility bill. So moving forward for the 2025 code cycle, these conversion will be removed, and this will just be presented in dollars. Now, just to sort of reiterate, these metrics do not represent a first-year utility bill. And there is still sort of some confusion about, does it represent a customer perspective or something else? And I think what's unique about these is that they're actually trying to capture certain elements of that customer perspective or the participant cost test, and that state perspective or the total resource cost test. And the way this is done is by basically calculating a retail rate forecast that a customer might see over the next 30 years and shaping it on an hourly basis using the marginal costs incurred by California's energy system. And so this is really trying to capture a lot of things in one single metric. I won't go into too much detail on how these are derived, but just to spend one slide on it, these are essentially aggregated cost components that are capturing the marginal cost of electricity, gas, and propane to California's energy system. The electric factors are mainly driven, the shape of the electric factors are mainly driven by two cost components in particular: the generation capacity cost, which is capturing the cost of maintaining a generator fleet with enough capacity to meet each year's peak loads, and the T&D capacity cost, which is the costs for maintaining and investing in new T&D capacity for when the system is most likely to be constrained and require upgrades. And as I mentioned, all of these are sort of, these marginal costs are calculated, and then the whole thing is scaled up or normalized to this annual retail rate forecast. And they use this, what's called the retail rate adder down here, this blue bar, to sort of make up for the difference between the marginal components and the overall rate forecast. The other metric that has recently been added in the 2022 code cycle is called the hourly source energy factors. And as Jack indicated, these are essentially trying to convert site energy to source energy, but on an hourly basis. So sort of as typical of source energy, these are accounting for the losses incurred through production, transmission, and delivery of energy to the building. Although these do not explicitly, these are not explicitly GHG emissions, they are strongly correlated to GHG emissions. And so this is another compliance metric that is currently used in the state of California. And I think it's important to note that both the hourly source energy factors and the life cycle, or the long-term system costs, are all hourly factors or hourly metrics. So they are, as Jack indicated, really trying to capture that effect that emissions and lots of system costs are changing on an hourly basis. And it's really cannot fully be captured if we just look at an annualized metric. So I know I've talked a lot about how things happen in California, but I sort of want to end on this note of why we as a community should care about some of these things, even if we are not working in California. So we've all heard the phrase, all models are wrong, but some are better than others. I think this statement also holds true for metrics. All metrics answer something, but it's very rare that any individual metric can give the full picture to a question. So from the work that I do, we often talk about reducing emissions or cutting GHG emissions and doing it cost effectively. And so if, as an industry, we are trying to collectively cost effectively reduce emissions from the building sector, then we should also be thinking about metrics that can sort of tackle that question from different perspectives. And so this is sort of reiterating a lot of the things that Jack already said, but the timing of metrics matter. Annual metrics really just can't provide the full picture if grid emissions and grid costs change on an hourly basis. The scale matters. We often think about what's happening at an individual building, but if the building's electricity is being provided by things that are happening outside of the bounds of that building, then we can't ignore that. And the units matter. So we talk a lot about energy consumption, but if we care about costs and we care about emissions, then maybe it's time to stop thinking explicitly just about energy. And so I want to end just with some of my hot takes. These are not endorsed by anyone. These are explicitly Jared Landsman's thoughts. But I believe sort of the time of EUI is over. I know that this metric is really just starting to get its groove in the industry, and some folks are just starting to use this, but I think maybe it's time to just sort of skip over the EUI and move on to what's next. I also think the topic of net zero energy is going to come to a close pretty soon, because it's really talking about what's happening on an annual basis and how to solve energy and generation on an annual basis, but not addressing what's happening on an hourly basis or what's happening at the grid. And my final statement, probably the most controversial of all, I believe that codes and standards for new construction, I won't say don't matter, because I think they will always matter, but they can only get us so far. I think at this point, we're really only making incremental changes to the new construction codes and standards that don't have a huge impact on state emissions. And we need to start thinking about how to address the existing building problem. And so I sort of posed that to the community at large at how we can do a better job at addressing that. that's all I have. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jared, for your wonderful, wonderful insights on this very complicated topic. I'm sure the audience appreciates it just as much as I do. Now, moving on to our final speaker, Jamie Backus. Jamie is an associate principal at ME Engineers, where he leads their building performance group in North America. He's a mechanical engineer, energy modeler, policy analyst, and sustainability consultant with nearly 30 years of experience designing building systems for green buildings and net zero energy projects. Jamie is the immediate past chair of USGBC's Energy and Atmosphere Technical Advisory Group to the lead rating system, where he led discussions on lead version 5 proposals to better reflect the urgency around carbon. He's a voting member of ASHRAE's new draft 242P for calculation of building operational greenhouse gas emissions. Jamie frequently presents at Greenbuild IBPSA-USA and ASHRAE on carbon and energy. Take it away, Jamie.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes, all good.
All right. I'll share a screen. All right. Is that showing in the slideshow now?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So I'm Jamie Backus, and I'm going to wrap up today's discussion on building performance metrics. Looking back historically, back in 1975, we got our first version of ASHRAE Standard 90. Believe it or not, it had a modeling pathway. It used EUI, or rather site energy use, as its performance metric. A couple years later, in 77, we had 90C come out. That has this really interesting site to source conversion table of where you are in the continental US and what the generation mix was in that region in the summer and in the winter, and then the fuel conversion, the energy efficiency of those power plants, what that was to give you a unique site to source conversion rather than the 2.85 that Jack was mentioning earlier. 1989, then we get our first view of the energy cost budget method that we all know and love. And then in 2004, we got our first performance rating method, PRM, that most lead projects have used, since most are avoiding the PCI methodology of 2016 onward. And now, jumping to today, we have a myriad of metrics. We have metrics that just talk about the envelope. We have metrics that just focus on the efficiency of the HVAC system. And then we have all these other buckets that both Jared and Jack mentioned about upstream carbon from the materials and the grid side. TEDI and other things like that are its own conversation. So we're going to focus mostly on carbon for today's discussion. And you saw a little bit of this in Jack's presentation. This is a slightly different version than the Rick's version that he showed, but it's the same carbon modules and nomenclature. So EN15978 and EN15643. 643 added the B8 user activities, which I love to throw in, which is excluded in the 15978, because how we get to and from our buildings is almost the biggest carbon emissions source when you compare that to other operational carbon or the materials, but we exclude it in almost all of our different protocols out there. In the operational carbon side, I usually look at B1 because that includes refrigerant leakage, B6 because that's all the energy converted into carbon, water conveyance and wastewater conveyance is B7 module, and then user activities, I said, is B8. We have a lot of net zero definitions. I just added DOE zero emissions buildings to this list yesterday. Last summer, I added ASHRAE Standard 228, which is a net zero energy and a net zero carbon standard. What do you notice about some of these? Well, some include materials, some don't. Only one of them includes transportation. And really only one includes refrigerant leakage. And so you have these boundaries, these gerrymandered boundaries of what we decide to exclude or include when we talk about net zero. And so when Jared was saying net zero is dead, it's because most people just look at it from that narrow view of 1 year of operational carbon. And so that's what ASHRAE Standard 228/2023 that came out last summer does. It doesn't look at any water or wastewater conveyance, but it looks at your on-site combustion, your scope 2 from your energy usage, your refrigerant leakage for a single year, so it doesn't look at end-of-life refrigerant, and it actually uses historical EGRID 2018 values. ASHRAE Standard 240P is in development. It's in its second phase of public comment, but it excludes any of the transportation of the user groups that module B8 carbon that I was talking about. This is a dated picture from NREL's Cambium. It's the first iteration, but it shows something that I think matters to most of the viewers on this webinar, that every region in the country is starting with a different electricity generation fuel mix and is moving in a different rate. Some are crawling, some are walking, and some are running towards decarbonization. Some have a renewable portfolio standard, so they have a mandate, regulatory mandate. Others have an aspirational goal, and some have no goal whatsoever, except that the economic pressures of maintaining an aging generation fleet might shift them towards decarbonization, whether they like it or not, because that's the lowest cost. And so if you open up the NREL Cambium viewer, this is what the main portal will look like. You will have to decide, do you want to look at the entire nation? Do you want to look at a state? Do you want to look at an EGRID sub-regional area or a balancing area? What global warming potential are you interested in? Do you want to include the upstream methane leakage from that natural gas system? So if your state or region is using a combined cycle gas plant for electricity generation, there is upstream methane leakage that is associated with that, whether it's on-site combustion or in that electricity generation, that should be included, or you can choose to exclude it. But if you're going to include it on your boilers and furnaces in the building, then you should include it in the electricity generation, to be fair. And then you have to look at different economic scenarios. And most of us are looking at the mid case and the low cost renewable energy scenarios. But these are economic forecasts that are used in these projections over the next 27 years. And then you have to choose whether you want average hourly factors or marginal short-term or long-term factors for your comparison and analyses. Here's a couple of these plotted, just to give an idea of the difference when Jared and Jack were talking about annualized versus hourly. So this is the Denver grid where I currently am sitting. And you see how NREL projects that it is going to be quite dirty on a seasonal basis and a diurnal basis on a daily basis, that some periods in the day are quite dirty and some are quite clean. And New York City is on the bottom of this. And again, 8760 plotted across, you see that you have this seasonal shift of a lot of hydro and then bringing on some fossil fuel generation towards the summer to meet that peak demand. And then you see the 2050 forecast that they're saying, because both of these regions have renewable portfolio standards, how they decarbonize, but still aren't able to potentially meet all of their targets and require some kind of fossil fuel generation. Those black lines that I've put on this are the annualized values. So again, I mentioned that I was picking on ASHRAE Standard 228 for its EGRID 2018 values. That is that single value running across the top that you would be using if you were pulling up and doing net zero carbon using that standard, is that you would be analyzing your building with this single value over the entire year versus this much messier blue line or this future orange projection or anything between. And these are the importances of using an hourly analysis over something annualized. So digging into a little bit of the data and the research that my team did that we presented last month here at SimBuild, we saw batteries help in some cases and not do much in other cases. Well, first off, if you're using an annual value like 228 says, you won't show any value of on-site storage, whether it's thermal storage or a battery, because there's no opportunity to shift carbon or dollars. So that is, if you're using a flat virtual rate, you can't show any benefit to using thermal storage because it's a flat rate and you're going to use more energy to store that energy and then release it. So any round trip efficiency, whether it's 10%, even 0%, you're not going to show a benefit of adding it. So this is looking at our New York City grid. And what we saw is that there's not a huge change between the daytime and nighttime carbon. And so storing this excess solar in the yellow didn't save enough carbon to justify the upfront embodied carbon of the battery system. That's not saying resiliency or other reasons are reasons not to use a battery. But when it came to what should we do with this excess solar when our building doesn't need it, well, the grid at that particular hour wasn't 100% renewable. And so exporting it to the grid seemed like a good solution. Now, California, a completely different scenario. We're looking over here at these hours where our building has excess solar in yellow, and the grid at those hours is also 100% renewable. So dumping this solar from your building's perspective, and this is something that Jared touched on, is the participant value versus the state, societal, and the utility benefit. And so dumping this excess solar doesn't do the grid any benefit. This is what we saw in April in California. In the California Independent System Operators grid, we saw over 800,000 megawatt hours curtailed of wind and solar because we had no place to use it and store it. And that number grows every year because we keep installing more solar and more wind and don't always have a place to put it. Switching over to refrigerants. The lead calculation for enhanced refrigerant management has always had the right components to give you the greenhouse gas emissions of your building's design. It just puts it into a normalized number of 100, and you're looking at that whether you're greater than or less than 100. It's useful for some things, but it doesn't give you your emissions total. But it has all the right components. You have your system life, you have your refrigerant charge in pounds per ton of cooling, you have your GWP of that refrigerant, and then you have your upfront leakage, your annualized leakage, and your end of life leakage, or the reclaimed amount of refrigerant charge. And so adding up all those and multiplying them through, you can then get your lifetime amount of global warming potential of that refrigerant charge. Now, 228, 240p, LEED, CARB, SIPSE's Technical Memorandum 65, none of them agree on how much leakage there is in different systems and over their life. So there is that nuance of like, what do you assume? But if you assume that a VRF system has the most refrigerant charge per cooling ton because of the line set lengths, and you assume that it has the greatest amount of leakage per year because of those field installed joints, then no surprise that system will look the worst in comparison to any other. If the refrigerant itself, in this case R410A, is the same throughout. As we move to next generation refrigerants and HFOs, that may not be the case, but it is still worth looking at what your GWP from your refrigerants are. I talk also about water and wastewater, so the B7 emissions module. And ASHRAE standard 240p also addresses this. It is an overlay of a couple different things. How your region and your municipality gets water. Is it surface water that you can just drain by gravity? Or is it groundwater that you have to pump out? Is it water that you're reclaiming from the sea in a desalination plant? And then the electricity in that region, is it clean or dirty? So even if you have an energy intensive water conveyance, is it a clean grid or a dirty grid? And so you'll see some areas in the country, like New York City, have a largely gravity fed system in the Catskills that is powered by a lot of low carbon energy. And so you have very clean water, potable water, municipal district. Moving on to some of the analyses, when you put all these together, and this is something we did at our paper that we presented last month here at SimBuild, was we took a P&L prototype, we took multifamily and we took office buildings, and we took the baseline building of an all-electric baseline with a gas system, switched it to an all-electric, and we a small amount of carbon. Then we switched to a cold climate heat pump and saved a little bit more. We switched it to a heat pump water heater, and that saved some additional because we had a lot of domestic hot water in our multifamily building. Then we added PVs, and then we added batteries. Then we switched to a low GWP refrigerant. And then we switched the construction to a mass timber from the concrete and steel. And we went from 2.7 million kilograms down to just under 1 million. So we're not at zero, but again, we're not looking with blinders at just the operational carbon. Switching over to our New York City office building, again, we didn't see a particular benefit when we used batteries because there was no carbon arbitrage, and the batteries had an initial upfront carbon that we were never able to offset. And so in this particular case, just putting PVs on the roof and exporting it to the grid was our lowest 28-year period carbon. So this is the paper. Hopefully IBPSA publishes it on their website soon. For those who weren't at the conference to get it. And as a final reminder, the Earth does not care about your gerrymandered carbon boundaries. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Jamie. This was very enlightening. It definitely makes a strong case for a lot of different things, especially hourly emissions versus annual emissions, and where you live and how your grid works. Everything is different. I know we are short on time, so I want to ask one question to all the three panelists. Uh, what are your parting thoughts on what would you tell an energy modeler like me if they are told to create an energy model? What should I focus on? Starting with Jack.
Thanks, Apoorva. I'm thinking back now to a conversation at ACEEE at the summer study 2 years ago, where Andrew McAllister told the assembled set of architects, engineers, designers in a special session, almost begging us like to do everything we can to make sure that buildings can become dispatchable resources to the grid rather than just loads on the grid. And I think this is really the frontier that we all need to be pushing on, is to really start to think about how patterns of operation, load shifting, et cetera, can turn buildings into resources instead of just loads.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Jared, do you want to go next on the same question?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, as energy modelers, we have the dual job of executing what a client is looking for, but also trying to be an educator and help them understand what they should be thinking about. And so I think energy modelers will always have that role of, on the topic of code compliance, answering, does this building comply or does it not comply, and how do we make it comply? But I think the questions that an energy modeler should be bringing to the table are more of what does it mean to comply, and why do we care about if it complies or not? Because at the end of the day, a client might just want to do things for as little money as possible, but I think we need to try to convince them. It's sort of our duty to convince them why they should care about things going on beyond just the bounds of their building.
Absolutely. Jamie?
Echo the same sentiments that Ask not what your grid can do for you, but what you can do for your grid. It is grid stewardship, grid harmonization, and optimization. And the same is true not just for upstream energy, but water conservation, anything. Stop thinking that, food is something that you just get at the grocery store. Where you get your stuff, it's not that you just plug it in and it's like, I don't care where the energy comes from. You should. If you're interested in climate change, you should care about all these things and their upstream impacts.
Absolutely. As someone rightly said in the chat, it's not about the points. Christine, do you think we have time for another question or?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Jared, talking about your hot take that EUI is over. And as you rightly said, that EUI is a matrix that has become popular recently now that with Architecture 2030 and the 2030 Commitment Challenge and everything, the architects are recognizing that this is an important matrix. And now I have to go and tell them that, hey, maybe this is not the matrix we should be looking at. So what are some of the what are some of the things that have worked for you when you're trying to move the conversation from EUI to the other matrix? What worked for you that we can use?
Yeah, so I will say I haven't had to, I have a slightly different role since I've joined E3 and have not been sort of working for an architect or a building owner necessarily. But I think I think the path forward is for those who have not yet thought about EUI, just to bring them to what comes next, that don't even maybe skipping over the EUI. But at the same time, I think it's about really just like what I mentioned before about education. So I think really like using like the kind of slides that Jack put together to sort of walk through why here's what EUI does well, but here's all these things that it misses. And I actually think so. I often bring up this the code compliance metrics in California because as an energy modeler, I always just sort of thought there were these meaningless metrics. Like just this black box. It was an arbitrary thing that just said yes or no to code compliance. But now, since I've been in the role of actually developing those metrics, I've learned that these tools or that these metrics can actually be a really interesting tool to help explain these topics to architects because they have to interact with them when they build a new building. So yeah, I think my recommendation is, at least in the state of California, but also some of these metrics exist outside of California, use some of those kinds of tools that an architect sort of has to come into contact with, but use it in a way that they've never thought about it before.
Awesome. Greg has a question for you, Jamie. He asks, should ASHRAE 90.1 abandon the cost matrix?
Well, I can't say what ASHRAE should do. I wish I had purview over that standard, but I don't. I think we're all going to have clients that want to know cost, that aren't as caring as Jared's standpoint of like, well, what does it do to the state? They want to know really as the ratepayer in his scenario, what's the ramifications there? And so I think it's going to be hard to ever escape from cost. But as far as a performance metric, yes, I think we should get rid of it because it has so many flaws. And anyone who works in a metro region that has multiple state jurisdictions, like, you could move a building across the river and it's like, well, it's great on this side of the Hudson, but over there in Jersey, it sucks. Or over there in Delaware, it's one thing, but in Philly, it's good. Like, we should have good buildings that are good carbon stewards. Now, the grid that it's connected to should matter, but the energy costs, I don't think are the best metrics to use to judge buildings by.
I would add to that
Someone's giving me a thumbs up.
slightly differing opinion that I do think costs matter. However, I don't think they should ever be the only metric that we're looking at.
Great. Well, thank you to Jared, Jamie, and Jack today for your time. We are running up on time. We're a minute over, and I know everyone's busy today. Yep, the triple J's. Thanks, Jack. I put a couple of links in the chat for everyone who's still online for some upcoming IBPSA-USA events. There is an event tonight hosted by the Denver chapter, Sim Club. It's going to be a What Ails You. You can talk to Jamie about all of his hot takes. I'm sure he'll be there tonight. If you are going to be in Indianapolis for the ASHRAE Summer Conference, there's also an IBPSA-USA member meeting this Saturday. Registration link in the chat as well. And if you found today's webinar insightful, mark your calendars for the next IBPSA-USA Education Committee webinar. It's going to be on coding and building performance simulation on August 21st. We just set up the registration link and more details to be coming soon. Again, thank you all for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.